When we last left off the story, we had the massacre at the Alamo and the less remembered but equally gruesome massacre at Goliad. How had the Texans and Mexicans come to this? Well, to recap briefly, the American planters who wanted to grow cotton voluntarily repatriated themselves, crossing the border from Louisiana into Texas, which was then part of Mexico. In 1829, Mexico abolished slavery, emancipating it in the entire country. Although they made an exception for Texas, Texans were very fearful that Mexico would abolish slavery in Texas too. When the Mexican government started to seize more power for itself and rein in the autonomy and the independence, especially of the fiercely independent northern states like Zacatecas, Coahuila, and of course Texas, they revolted. In the case of Texas, the revolt was led by the Americans who had come into Texas bringing enslaved Africans with them and planting cotton. Alongside them were a handful of Tejanos, which is how you refer to people of Mexican descent who were born in Texas, right, or Latino descent. They were the Tejanos, and many of them, actually, particularly the upper class, sided with the white Americans when they revolted against the Mexicans because they thought that the best hopes for Texas, which had long been neglected by the central government of Mexico, lay in the hands of these white Texans who had moved in. So ultimately, these are the causes of rebellion, and Santa Anna himself invades Texas. Where we left off, the rebels at the Alamo they surrendered, and every last one of them was killed. The same thing happened at Goliad a few days later after that. Cruelty marked the Mexican campaign, and Santa Anna usually very quickly and judiciously cut down the prisoners of war. He ordered that no prisoners be taken. Santa Anna thought that the war would be over. He had scared the Texans into submission, and he figured that his military exploits would probably play well in the press at home down in Mexico City. But in fact, the ruthlessness Santa Anna had displayed against the Texas rebels at the Alamo and at Goliad crystallized opposition to Mexico and Texas. And abroad, Americans, men, supplies, weapons, guns, volunteers started pouring into Texas, remembering the massacres that had occurred of their fellow Americans at the Alamo and the Goliad. I mean, these were some very well-known Americans. Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone were both killed at the Alamo, right? These were famous household names in America in the 19th century, and they had seen their countrymen heroes, or at least in their opinion, killed by Mexicans. The fact that they were there to defend Texas and the right of Texans to hold enslaved people in bondage was left out of the story until fairly recently. But in fact, of course, these were famous Americans, and what ends up happening is people from all over the south of the United States start pouring into Texas. And, Santa Anna quickly realizes that he's not just fighting people who have been in Texas all along. He's fighting people who are pouring in across the border in Louisiana, from Kentucky, from Tennessee, from Louisiana, volunteers who are coming in to defend Texas's right to own slaves and its independence from Mexico. What ends up happening is that the army grows. There is a scuffle between the Americans and Santa Anna at San Jacinto River on April 21st. What ends up happening is that the Texans rout the Mexicans, and they capture San Antonio trying to flee. This was a somewhat inglorious 20-minute battle that ended the Texas revolt. And not only did it end the Texas revolt in favor of the Texans, the general in charge of the other side had been captured. And not only was he the general, he was also the president of the neighboring country. Texans, of course, held him hostage for about 3 or 4 weeks. Right? He took a trip to Washington, D.C. to have a treaty negotiated before he was finally released and allowed to return to Mexico City. And what Santa Anna does when he is negotiating this treaty with Texas is that he does 2 things. He recognizes the independence of Texas. Okay, that's a big deal. But secondly, he recognizes the border between Texas and Mexico at the Rio Grande. right? Where the border between Mexico and the United States is today, you know, where they're going to build that wall. That place right there, that was established when Texas had Santa Anna held as a prisoner, forcing him to sign a treaty which would put the border between Texas and Mexico at the Rio Grande. Well, what could Santa Anna do? He signed the treaty. And ultimately, he was allowed to return home, where Mexican Congress was very upset with him indeed for having A, recognized the independence of Texas, and B, recognizing the Rio Grande as the river between Mexico and Texas. The Rio Bravo del Norte, which is how Mexicans refer to the Rio Grande, was about 100 miles south of where they thought the border should be. They thought the border should be the Nueces River, but they thought it should be quite a bit further north than the Rio Grande River. Well, Santa Anna, under duress, kidnapped, being held as a prisoner, a captive of war by Texas, signed this treaty anyways. And the Texans, as far as they were concerned, it was a done deal. But for the next 10 years or so, Texas, this newly independent republic, at least in their view, and England would recognize them as would the United States, ultimately the Texas Republic would continue this long simmering war with Mexico, which would ultimately lead to the events of the U.S.-Mexico War, which I will discuss shortly. Texas remained independent until 1845, but they could only remain independent because Mexico was actually terribly divided and racked with all types of internal convulsions that it could not manage to reconquer. Despite attempts, Adrian Wool in 1842, a Mexican general, recaptured San Antonio, Texas, and held it for the Mexicans for a while. But the United States recognized Texas's independence in 1837. They did not annex Texas because A, they didn't want to provoke a war with Mexico, at least not yet, and B, if they had brought Texas into the Union, remember, the Texans had fought for their independence to defend their rights as slaveholders, right? That would mean bringing more slave states into the Union. We're going to talk in great length about this next week, but that was always a concern to keep the number of free states and slave states equal before the American Civil War was fought. So Mexico continued to fight against Texas. Texas continued to be a republic up until 1845 and the events precipitating the U.S.-Mexico War. But the reason I talk about the independence of Texas is they managed to do something that 25 years later, the Confederate States of America will not be able to accomplish. They were able to break off from a government that was based in the nation's capital that they thought had become too strong. And the reason that they broke off was to defend the rights of slaveholders to hold enslaved people as property. The difference is the Texans were successful. They gained their independence. Now, as an independent country, Texas was a mess. They had no infrastructure to sell cotton, so the cotton that they sent out to market was always kind of dirty, right? It hadn't been cleaned properly. They were terribly in debt. England wasn't sure if they wanted to buy their cotton from Texas or not, since they were so clearly a slaveholders' republic. They were beset with all sorts of problems. But nevertheless, we should never forget that Texas did win its independence and remained a republic briefly before the United States ultimately annexed Texas. And it would put up the fourth flag, the fourth of the six flags that Texas ultimately would display over itself, hence Six Flags of America, the Texas Republic.